Eleanor of Aquitaine was queen consort in England and France. Her marriage to the head of England's Plantagenet dynasty, Henry II, produced 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and John of England, 2 of England's most notable kings of the Middle Ages. Full of danger, heartbreak, romance, and glamour, her story is the ultimate medieval epic. Eleanor was born into a wealthy noble family in 1122. Her father, William X, was the Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Poitiers. He owned more lands than the French king down in what is now southern France. Tragically, her mother died when she was 8, and she spent many years traveling with her father around his lands as he oversaw his vassals. When he died in 1137, Eleanor inherited his domain at 15. She was now the first and only woman that ruled her own duchy. The French king at the time, known as Louis the Fat, wasted no time in securing Eleanor, and more importantly, her lands, for his son. He quickly sent 500 men and his son to propose to Eleanor and bring her back with him to the king's palace. That July, she married Louis VII, who became king of France the following month. Accounts suggest that they were genuinely in love. They both loved poetry, tournaments, and hunting. As queen consort, Eleanor held a lot of power over her adoring husband. However, she hated life at the French court. Removed from the warm sunny days in the south of France, stuck in the much colder and more dreary palaces of the north, and not well liked by the king's subjects, Eleanor was miserable. It didn't help that the king's advisors did not approve of this educated woman, unafraid to share her opinions. She was renowned for her beauty and fickle nature, and she would remain the Queen of France for the next 15 years. 7 years after they were married, Eleanor and Louis still had no children. Eleanor had suffered a miscarriage previously, and finally, in 1144, she gave birth to a baby girl. They would end up having 2 daughters together over the course of their marriage, but no male heirs. The French medieval poet Bernard de Ventadour described her as, quote, gracious, lovely, the embodiment of charm. But what she actually looked like remains a mystery. There are no accounts of any of her features, and even the effigy on her tomb is probably not an accurate depiction of what she really looked like. She accompanied her husband Louis on the Second Crusade from 1147 to 1149 to protect the Kingdom of Jerusalem. While stopped in Constantinople, the French courtiers were dazzled by the Byzantine culture, and it is likely that Eleanor brought some of their fashions back with her to France. When the couple reached Antioch, Eleanor was delighted to be reunited with her uncle, but Louis soon grew jealous of their close relationship. Tensions grew as Eleanor's uncle and Louis argued over strategy for the crusade, and Louis was furious over the fact that Eleanor supported her uncle so strongly that she had even proposed divorcing him. After a devastating loss in the crusade, the couple returned to France via separate ships, but on the way home, Eleanor was captured by the Sicilian navy and spent some time at the Sicilian court until being permitted to return to France. By the time she returned, the marriage had fallen apart, despite her giving birth to her second daughter in 1150. In August 1151, Eleanor met Geoffrey Plantagenet and his son and heir, Henry. It is said that the two were extremely attracted to one another immediately, despite their roughly 12-year age difference. It is purported that a secret arrangement might have been reached for Eleanor to marry Henry, with the understanding that her marriage to Louis was soon to be annulled. The marriage was finally annulled in March of 1152 on the grounds of consanguinity, which means that they were too closely related, as they were third cousins once removed. The true reason for this annulment was most likely the lack of a male heir. After the annulment of her first marriage, Eleanor regained the possession of Aquitaine. 2 months after the annulment, 30-year-old Eleanor married 18-year-old Henry II of England, aka Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy. Some historians claim that Eleanor could have been intimate with Henry's father before she met Henry. Their marriage united a vast amount of French territory under their rule, making them a formidable threat to the French king. She is sometimes referred to as the grandmother of Europe, because Eleanor and Henry's 8 children would go on to either rule England or, in the case of their daughters, be married off to the kings and noblemen all over Europe, and her and Henry's offspring would rule various parts of Europe for the next 330 years. She was actively involved in the running and administration of her court. In fact, her court of Poitiers hosted some of the most famous troubadours, such as Chrétien de Troyes, one of the most famous lyrical poets of the time. These poets had her as their patron, where she supported the movement of courtly love as shared in their love songs and the movement of the Legends of Brittany, which has its origins in Celtic tradition, all in an effort to reinstate the chivalry characteristic of the legend of King Arthur's court. As her husband Henry governed the country on horseback, traveling frequently, Eleanor acted as regent and would administer justice in his absence. After the birth of her final child, John, Eleanor and Henry's marriage began to decline. Her jealousy of his long affair with the court beauty Rosamond Clifford was a major reason for this. So she went to Poitou for 5 years, but on her return to England, she was ambushed by rebel barons. Her protector, Patrick, Earl of Salisbury, was stabbed in the back, and his nephew William rescued her. He went on to become one of England's greatest knights of the Middle Ages, as well as Marshal of England. While in Poitou, she gained the support of her nobles, who pledged loyalty to her over Henry. Unfortunately for Henry, the brutal murder of Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, by some of Henry's magnates forever tarnished his reputation and destabilized his power in favor of his wife and sons. Throughout Eleanor and Henry's marriage, Eleanor's sons attempted multiple revolts against their father, some of which had Eleanor's support. For instance, in 1173, her sons rebelled against their father with the help of some of Eleanor's money and troops. Unfortunately for her, this rebellion was unsuccessful, and Eleanor was imprisoned in various castles across the kingdom until Henry's death in 1189. Eleanor then, aged 67, was able to involve herself once again in court life and the running of the kingdom as a mentor to her beloved son Richard. She organized his magnificent coronation, but warned him against joining the Third Crusade. Unfortunately for him, he ignored her, probably in part due to a longing to live out his own Arthurian legend by gaining a reputation for courage and honor on the battlefield. While Richard was away fighting for the next 5 years, Eleanor practically governed the kingdom and tried to stop any attempts by Richard's brother, John, to usurp the throne. When Richard was captured and imprisoned by the Duke of Austria, Eleanor paid his ransom and went to Austria to bring him back to England. In 1199, Richard tragically died after a wound incurred in battle while besieging a fortress, and her youngest son John was crowned king. You may recognize him as the king that signed the Magna Carta, or the greedy king portrayed in Robin Hood. John was plagued by wars with France over territory, but Eleanor was able to secure peace by promising her granddaughter Blanche to the French king's son. So, at almost 80 years old, she rode on horseback across the Pyrenees mountains to retrieve Blanche from the Castilian court and bring her back to France. Eleanor did what she could to help John protect their lands in France. In fact, in 1202, records attest that John was in debt to her for her support in helping to defend English holdings in France against her grandson, Arthur of Brittany. Shortly after helping John defend his territory in France, Eleanor, now in her early 80s, retired to a monastery in Anjou to live out the rest of her days in peace. She died there in 1204, but her legacy and the legacy of her children has lived on until today. Her influence, boldness, bravery, and tact made her a force to be reckoned with, which made her many enemies among misogynistic historians and many of the men at court. Eleanor was not a docile queen, confined to a gilded cage. She refused to be confined to tradition. Instead, she forged her own path and lived a truly unique life as one of the most powerful women in Europe for centuries. Her legacy deserves to be remembered. The nuns at the monastery where she died wrote in her obituary notice that, quote, "She was beautiful and just, imposing and modest, humble and elegant. She enhanced the grandeur of her birth by the honesty of her life, the purity of her morals, the flower of her virtues, and in the conduct of her blameless life she surpassed almost all the queens of the world." She was probably all of these things, but looking back through the 21st century lens, her tenacity and courage are also evident in her unforgettable legacy.